welcome back to Yoga Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Waycott. If you're new here, I've been teaching yoga for the past 14 years in a wide range of settings. And today I run a fully independent yoga business that doesn't rely on studio classes. I host pre-registered yoga series for my community. I offer continuing education for my peers. And occasionally, I train aspiring yoga teachers at the 200-hour level. Over the years, I have learned a lot about teaching with clarity and with depth and creating a career in the yoga industry that's actually sustainable. A really big part of my mission is to have honest and grounded conversations with real yoga teachers around the world about what it's actually like to work in the modern yoga industry. And that is what Yoga Insider is here for. So grab yourself a cup of coffee and join me for today's episode. This week on Yoga Insider, I am breaking down how to build a yoga class around a peak pose. In my own teaching, peak pose sequencing is something that I use quite frequently. It is one of my absolute favorite ways to teach and build a class. And what I love about building a class around a peak pose is the way that it allows you to take your students on a journey. And it's a journey that is very purposeful and really prepares the mind and the body for moving in a certain direction. So I'm going to preface this episode by saying that sequencing around a peak pose is one of many really, really wonderful methods for sequencing. I feel like sequencing is always evolving and there's always like amazing new creative ways to sequence. And there's also lots of, older tried and tested methods for sequencing as well. And I think that peak pose sequencing has a time and a place, and it may or may not be suitable for you and your community. So with that being said, when you're listening to today's episode, take what resonates and feels appropriate for you and for your students and leave the rest. I think that it makes sense to start this conversation by identifying what a peak pose actually is. So within the context of a regular yoga class, the peak pose is typically the posture that the sequence is organized around. And usually this means that the warm-ups and the preparatory poses leading up to the peak pose are designed to help your students explore the key actions that are going to show up in that peak posture so that when they arrive there, they've already experienced those actions in their bodies. Now, a peak pose doesn't have to be the most physically challenging yoga pose in existence. I feel like sometimes there's this idea out there that, peak poses, they have to be really advanced and really complicated, and that is simply not the case. Honestly, anything can be a peak pose if you're feeling creative enough. But typically, it is the posture that is going to require the most demand or the most preparation in that specific class. And of course, things like challenge and demand are very subjective, but generally speaking, the peak pose is going to require a certain amount of skill or effort that is going to be best executed through thoughtful preparation. And that's where sequencing around a peak pose really comes into play. Now, does every yoga class need a peak pose? No. It's just like theming, right? Not every yoga class needs a theme. You're in charge, you get to decide. Some classes are more exploratory and are designed to simply feel well-rounded and offer people a little bit of everything. In some cases, the style of class that you're teaching might not necessarily lend itself towards peak pose sequencing, and your class might be a style that's more about maintaining like a steady energy throughout the whole class. So I feel like we see that a lot more with yin and restorative type classes where we're just trying to keep this nice steady energy throughout rather than like building up to an arc and building heat and then coming back down, just generally speaking, okay? But in other cases, a peak pose can be a really powerful educational tool. And that's really the way that I like to see it. So I want to address a couple of arguments that I hear against peak poses. And these are the arguments that this particular teaching method is either too focused on achievement and performance, and it's all about just like getting to that one peak pose. Or the other thing that I hear is people saying that classes that are sequenced around a peak pose are not balanced because you might be repeating the same action over and over. So, of course, there is always the risk of becoming too attached to achieving a specific pose or too attached to achieving anything for that matter. But as yoga teachers, we can let our students know that when we are working towards a peak pose, it is always the preparation that is the most valuable. And like we can take some of that weight and some of that emphasis off of like the peak pose itself just by explaining that. And like I teach peak poses all the time, and I say that same thing all the time whenever I'm teaching them. Like I pretty much always start out my class by being like, just know that like it's the prep that matters. It's the prep that's valuable. And I don't care whether or not you like achieve the peak pose today. Okay. So we can say those types of things and remind our students that like there's no prize for doing the peak pose. But we have to see the preparation as an opportunity to work with specific skills and techniques and actions that are going to apply to a broad range of asana. And that's really cool. That's something that is going to be transferable for our students in other classes with other teachers. And to me, that's a really, really good thing. So we can empower through education, and the more our students know, the less reliant they are on us. If we're teaching well, we basically want to put ourselves out of a job. And I don't want codependent students. I want students who are empowered with knowledge and who practice with me because they want to, but not because they have to, not because they are ever dependent on me, because if that was ever the case, then you have a problem. So the other argument that peak pose sequencing is not balanced is also kind of funny because when you work out, for example, you're probably not going to work every muscle group in one session or one workout. You're probably going to focus on specific parts of your body. And I think that it's okay to focus on specific things. And as a yoga teacher, what's really cool is you can rotate through different peak poses throughout the month. And that way you're going to give your students a pretty well-rounded experience. So I think it's more important to look at the big picture rather than expecting every yoga class to work like every muscle group in your body and give you this like perfect experience every single time. I don't think that's realistic. And just to illustrate this for you, I keep track of like the peak poses that I'm teaching every month, and I'll share some of the poses with you that I've taught over the past month or so, just so that you can kind of see the variety. So this is a real life example, and just keep in mind that these peak poses were selected for a group of experienced students and experienced yoga teachers in those classes as well. There were no beginners in the room. So if I was teaching a foundational class or if I was teaching a class where I knew that there were going to be beginners, I would probably pick different peak poses, okay? But here's just like a list of a few lately, like straight out of my teaching book today. So recently I've taught revolved half moon pose, bird of paradise, firefly pose. So that's a hand balance, Titibhasana. I feel like sometimes people call it by other names. Wheel pose, crow pose, revolved triangle, wild thing. Okay, so you can see that there is quite a bit of variety there, and you've got poses that really work the posterior chain, poses that engage the deep front line, poses where you're working with deeper spinal rotation or more pronounced extension. And if you were a student in those classes and you're looking at your practice over the course of a month, then you're actually getting some really nice variety. So I like to keep track of the peak poses that I'm teaching to make sure that I'm also rotating through like families of poses throughout the month. So people are moving in different ways. And I feel like it ends up being fairly well-rounded. Like yoga is never perfect, but we do our best. I also think it's important to keep in mind that peak poses can be simple. And if we are working with beginners specifically, something like Warrior Two or Bridge or Tree Pose could absolutely function as a peak pose. And at the end of the day, it's really about learning specific actions and understanding the mechanics of the pose. And that is what makes peak pose sequencing such a great educational tool. Like we really get to be nitty-gritty about it and break down the poses. And for us as teachers, I feel like it makes us better teachers and better students because we are looking at the poses in a certain way. We're analyzing them and breaking them down and like building intelligent sequences around them. I just feel like it's a really cool way to teach. So at this point, I want to address a few of the questions that tend to come up when teachers first start working with peak poses in their classes. And the first one is, how do I choose a peak pose? So the number one thing that I would say is that when you're choosing a peak pose, you really want to consider your audience. And I think that you can ask yourself questions like, who am I teaching? So who comes to my class? How is the class advertised? Is it advertised as foundational, beginner friendly, mixed levels? Is it advertised as like prior experience necessary? So like think about all of those different things, right? Like start to paint a picture of who your students are, who your audience is. And then the other thing I would try not to forget about is how long is the yoga class. So how much time do you actually have to work with in that class to prep for your peak pose? Because that is also going to dictate like where you go. There are some poses that I'm just not going to attempt to teach in a 60-minute class, but I might try them in a 90-minute class, and I might try them in a workshop or a teacher training setting where I feel like I need a little bit more time. Okay? So that information, like who's coming to your class, all of that is going to inform the peak pose that you choose. So let's just say, for example, you're teaching a foundational yoga class and you know that a lot of people are going to be attending for like the first time ever. Maybe it's a class like a foundational community class at your local yoga studio, and people are coming in and like new people are coming in every weekend just to try it out. You never really know who's going to be there. I would choose a peak pose that doesn't have a ton of elements of complexity, right? So like we're probably just going to focus in on like specific key actions rather than trying to do a whole bunch of different things at once. So for beginners, I love poses like Warrior Two, triangle pose, modified side angle, bridge pose, camel pose, tree, half moon, maybe crow if you think a hand balance is suitable for your group. And it's really important to remember that we can be really creative and we can make the peak pose work for our students. So depending on your group, maybe half moon is the peak pose and it's half moon at the wall because you know that that extra support is going to be really beneficial to the majority of the people in the room. Maybe you decide that crow pose is going to be good for your group, but you set it up where everybody's got a bolster right in front of them in case they face plant. So just remember, like, you can adapt the peak pose as well and be creative with it so that it meets the needs of your students and so that it meets your students where they're at. Okay, so we also have to like think outside the box when it comes to our peak poses. Now, does everyone in the room need to succeed or like attempt to achieve the peak pose? No. I really like to emphasize that the fun is in giving it a try. The value is in the preparation. But if nobody in the class achieves the peak pose, then that's usually a sign that it was too hard. If nobody attempts the peak pose, it's definitely too hard. My guideline that I like to follow, and I mean, you might have something different, so this is just take it with a grain of salt. But I feel like if about 30% of the room achieves the peak pose, you've probably found the sweet spot where people are being challenged just enough, right? Like it's not too easy. Some people are doing it. Some people are trying it. Some people are getting really close to it, not quite there. Like, I feel like that's kind of a fun place to be and a place that usually feels good for people. But, you know, if you're in that situation where you've offered the peak pose and then everybody just sits there like blinking at you, not wanting to try it, that's usually a sign that like it's not right for your group. But ultimately, I think the most important factor when you're choosing the peak pose in the first place is how well you know your students and how well you know the people in front of you. And depending on the nature of your classes and the way that you teach, like you might not always know the people that you're going to be teaching. So you do your best. But the better you understand your students and their experience, their needs, their injuries, their energy on like any given day, it is going to be easier to choose something that feels appropriate and engaging for them if you know your students. And I would say that that is one of the benefits to teaching pre-registered series like I do primarily, is that it gives you the opportunity to like get to know your students over time because you have the same students in class week after week and you get really good at knowing like what they might be capable of and what's going to be suitable for them. When you're picking the peak pose, it's never about showing off like what you can do or how advanced you are. It's not about you at all as a teacher. It is meant to create like a positive and empowering experience for your students. And when your choice reflects the reality of the room and the people that are in your classroom, then the entire class feels intentional and the experience is going to feel a lot more supportive for your students and for the people who are there that day. Next question is a little bit more nitty-gritty. It is, how do I identify the key actions and component parts of my peak pose? So when you are planning a yoga class around a peak pose, it is helpful to break down that peak pose into what's often referred to as component parts. And in other words, you want to ask yourself, what are the physical and energetic actions required for this posture to happen? And when I look at the pose as a whole, what's going on? Like, what is actually happening in the yoga pose if I had to describe it to someone? Once you understand those pieces, then you can build the rest of the practice to gradually prepare the body for the peak pose. So when we're doing like peak pose sequencing, it's kind of like we work backwards. And rather than like building the whole practice just from like, the opening and the introduction and the warm up and like moving all the way through it in order, we start kind of like midway through with the peak and we work backwards from there. So there's a few really important things to look for when we are trying to identify the key actions and component parts of a peak pose. And the first thing is identifying the primary joint actions. So basically, this is just like, what are the major movements happening in the major joints of the body if we look at the pose as a whole? So for example, is the pose primarily what we would call like hip opening? So is one leg in pretty like prominent external rotation, like in pigeon pose or warrior two, for example? You might also consider what's happening in the spine. Like, what's the key action in the spine? Is it something really noticeable? So maybe there's a big back bend. Maybe it's like really obvious spinal extension, like you would see in camel pose or wheel pose or bridge pose. Maybe your peak pose is a twist and you've got some really noticeable spinal rotation going on. Like those types of things we just want to make note of, right? Like, what are the key actions happening in the joints of the body? And identifying those main joint actions is going to tell you what areas of the body need to be prepared for the peak in your sequence. Then we also want to look at the strength requirements of the pose. So this is typically what muscles need to be active or engaged to do the posture. So for example, if your peak pose is a hand balance or like a more active inversion, there's probably going to be a lot of core strength required. So you might think about doing a little bit more specific preparation to engage, the core and those stabilizer muscles. Maybe there's some really noticeable glute engagement. So your peak pose might be a back bend or a standing leg balance where like the glutes and the rest of the legs need to be really active as well. And ideally your sequence is going to include poses that are going to help your students build the strength needed to safely attempt that peak pose. And it doesn't mean that they're going to build all of that strength in one yoga class, but it's going to show them what is required, right? And what's necessary, perhaps over a long period of time to get to a certain point. You are also going to look at the mobility requirements of the pose. And sometimes you can just see this really simply as like what needs to be opened, right? Like what muscles are engaged and then what parts of the body need to be opened up. So if it's like triangle pose or half moon, you're probably going to want to open up the hamstrings. Maybe it's a back bend like camel pose. You're probably going to want to work with the hip flexors. And preparing like with these in mind when you're making your sequence is going to make the pose more accessible. Okay, there's more to this list, so I'm going to keep going. We can get quite detailed with it. You are also going to consider like balance or coordination demands. So some poses are going to require certain kind of like neuromuscular coordination and not just flexibility or strength. So some examples of this are if your peak pose is a single leg balance, right? So tree pose, half moon, dancer's pose. Other examples are like if there's weight transfer into the hands. So say you're hand balancing, you're probably going to want to include simpler balancing shapes earlier on in the practice if you are building towards a pose that has those requirements. So I usually say like if your peak pose is a standing leg balance, you don't want the peak pose to be the first standing leg balance that you do in the practice. Ideally, you have done a simpler standing leg balance prior to the peak pose standing leg balance, okay? second last one to look for, and this is a really big one, but it's basically like looking at the pose as a whole and asking yourself, are there other poses that look similar to my peak pose? And sometimes the easiest way to prepare for a peak pose is to teach simpler versions of the same shape. So for example, you could prepare for half moon pose by taking triangle pose. Okay, pretty similar. Difference with triangle pose is both feet are on the ground, right? And then maybe eventually you move the hand forwards and you float the back foot off the earth. But these poses are going to help your students recognize the structure and a lot of like the principles in the body that will need to be applied for the peak pose before they attempt it, right? So like we can see a lot of similarities in the legs, the hips, the pelvis, the shoulders in triangle pose that are also going to show up in half moon pose, right? Just to give you an example. And then the last thing that I would kind of look through and consider would just be the energetic quality of the peak pose. So know what that is. Is your peak pose more grounding? Is it uplifting? Is it playful? And know that the pace of your class, the rhythm of your class, the theme of your class can all support that same quality so that the peak pose feels like it is showing up very naturally, like it makes sense for the class because you've brought in those energetic qualities in other ways prior to getting to the peak. Okay? So just to kind of go back over this again, because I know that that's a lot, but when you understand the joint actions, the strength requirements, the mobility requirements, balance demands, and then just like the overall shape of the pose, your sequencing is going to become a lot easier. And you will be able to create a pathway through your sequencing that feels very clear for your students as they're preparing for that peak. So when I'm teaching this in like a yoga teacher training setting, what I usually do is I have students look at their peak pose, identify what the key actions and component parts are, and then make lists of poses or movements that are going to bring those specific joint actions or mobility needs into the body. So for example, let's say that our peak pose is wheel pose, Urdhva Dhanurasana. When we look at the pose as a whole, what's happening? So probably the most noticeable, Waylon's back. Probably the most noticeable action is spinal extension, right? It is a big back bend. The whole posterior chain is engaged and activated. And so if we are trying to prepare our students for a big back bend, we're probably going to start with smaller back bends and smaller, simpler, like back strengthening exercises in the class. Things like bird dogs on all fours, cobra, sphinx, locust, bridge. In terms of mobility needs, the hip flexors and the chest need to be open for wheel pose. So we might think about adding some lunges into our sequence, some variations of lizard pose into the sequence. And when we look at wheel, we also see things like shoulder flexion and wrist flexion with the arms up in the overhead plane. And we're going to want to make sure that like during the practice, we get the arms up by the ears, like taking downward facing dog, for example. So when you start working backwards from the peak pose, sequencing becomes a lot simpler because there is this clear pathway that gradually prepares the body for what's coming. And what I like the most about this sequencing method is that every posture in the sequence has a purpose. Everything is there for a reason, and it's really easy for you to tell your students the why behind the poses. Like, this is why we're working on this specific action. This is why this specific pose is here, because you need it to get closer to the peak. And so throughout the class, you're either building strength, you're either creating mobility, or introducing a shape that your students are going to need later on. And That's super, super cool. It's going to feel really intentional for your students. Once you have identified the key actions and component parts of the peak pose, the next step is to build your sequence and layer in complexity gradually throughout the sequence. So you're not jumping straight into big movements. You're not putting the peak pose right at the beginning. It usually comes more than halfway through. And you're going to want to introduce like the key actions of the peak pose in simpler, more accessible ways first. So maybe your class begins with some gentle mobility or really simple strength work down on the floor, where your students are going to be able to feel that action in their bodies without worrying about things like their balance or like adding load. And then you're slowly going to build. So you might add more weight bearing. You might move towards larger ranges of motion or more coordination, more like difficulty as the practice progresses. So if we go back to that example, that wheel is our peak pose, you might begin with really small like activations for the back body, like those bird dogs I was talking about, like locust pose variations, maybe some low lunges to start to open the hip flexors. And then you build and you introduce back bends like Sphinx or Cobra or upward facing dog. Maybe you add your lizard variations. That might be followed by a bridge pose on your back as you get a little bit closer to the peak, where you start to organize the body in a way that looks more similar to the peak pose. And then by the time your students are ready to attempt wheel, they've already experienced those same key actions multiple times in their bodies, just in like progressive ways, where maybe it becomes a little bit more challenging or a little bit more complex as the class carries on. So when you approach sequencing this way, the peak pose isn't going to feel random to your students. It's not going to feel like, oh, you just randomly pop that in there. It should feel like a very natural culmination of everything that came before it, because your students have been steadily building strength and mobility and coordination to maybe attempt that pose and maybe not, right? It doesn't really matter either way. Now, once you have taught the peak pose, it is still going to inform what comes after it in the rest of a class and the rest of the sequence. So what I like to do is consider the energetic quality of my peak pose and what types of poses or practices are going to complement that and make the class feel balanced or well-rounded. So if my peak pose was really like uplifting or really invigorating, I'm probably going to want to end my class with poses that feel a little bit more grounding, a little bit more restful. I might also consider what is going to feel good after the peak pose. So if they just did a big back bend, maybe an inversion or something that kind of like neutralizes the spine a little bit, maybe a twist might feel good after doing that. And by the time you reach that final portion of the practice, sequencing tends to become less about preparing the body mechanically and more about just like balancing the overall energy of the class. So this is really an opportunity to help your students like integrate what they've done, feel the effects of the peak pose in their body. It is about bringing the nervous system back to a little bit of a more grounded place, where ideally you're creating this feeling that there is a sense of completion. And so your students feel like they have not only worked during the class, but they've also had a little bit of time to integrate that work as well. One more question about working with peak poses, and this is such a good one. It is, how do I know when to abandon the peak pose. So this is something that comes with experience, and part of working with peak poses is knowing when to like let them go or just decide like, actually, we're not going to go there today. And the reality is that sometimes you arrive to class and like the energy in the room is just not there. Maybe you've shown up with a peak pose that is really energetic and really ambitious, and people are just like dragging their feet and they're laying on the ground and they're like, we're so tired today. Like today was such a hard day, right? And you can just tell right from the beginning, like, like maybe this just isn't the vibe. And like sometimes people get moving and, after 10, 15, 20 minutes, like things change and people actually start to feel better. And if that's the case, that's great. But if people have shown up and maybe there's a bunch of brand new students, or people are having injuries or recovering from illness, and, like all those natural things that just happen, I feel like in those moments, it's really important to be responsive rather than being rigid about the plan, right? And sometimes I see that, like, and this is like, I'm not being like a hater or anything like that, but I feel like sometimes I see teachers who are just like so stuck to the plan, and they're like, it's like eyes on their paper and they have to do exactly what they have written down. But like you're in the class and you're looking around the room and you're like, like this isn't going well, or, they're so stuck to the plan and they go over time because of it, things like that, right? And again, it's just like one of those skills that comes with time and with practice, is learning to be responsive to the people around you. Now, as a really simple way to kind of gauge this is just to pay attention to how students are responding during the prep work. So if the prep poses seem like they are a really big challenge for a lot of students, or people look like they're really struggling with the preparatory poses, that's usually a sign that the peak pose might not be appropriate for that group on that particular day. And we always just have to come back to that reminder that like the value is in the preparation. It's not always about like doing the actual peak pose. So if you do decide to pivot or to not teach the peak pose that you'd planned the class around, that's perfectly okay. Like you can just teach up until that point and not teach the peak pose and then carry on. And I feel like the class will still feel complete and it will still feel intentional for your students. And yeah, sometimes like the peak pose just isn't necessary. Right? Or sometimes, you've made this grand plan and it doesn't work out. And like, I abandon peak poses fairly frequently. The other day I was asking my students if they like when I give them like a little bit of a synopsis of what I'm going to teach ahead of time. I'm like, do you like it when I tell you what we're working towards? Because sometimes I do that, like before we even get into the practice, like still right at the beginning when everybody's just kind of hanging out and chatting, I'll be like, by the way, like here, the like here's a little bit of my plan. Here's a little bit of what we're going to be working towards. And they all said that they like when I tell them that, but the risk is that if I tell them, hey, we're working towards this specific peak pose today, it's that like we might not always get to that peak pose. And a lot of times I'll let people know like, hey, we have a peak pose today and it's a pretty ambitious peak pose, and I don't know whether we'll get there or not, right? So like keep an open mind. We might get to the peak pose or we might not get to it. And it's fine either way. And just, I want to add a little thing is that because I like peak pose sequencing, I also like to teach 90-minute classes because it gives me more time to prep like really intelligently for the peak. I feel like there's just so much more that we can do in a 90-minute practice than we can do in an hour-long practice. And when I'm teaching 90-minute practices, it's never about doing more. It's never about intensity or like we need to do yoga longer. It's actually about being more purposeful. It's about preparing slowly. It's about taking our time to like meticulously get to a certain point. And I know that 90-minute classes are a little bit old school, but I stand by them. I feel like they really help with the peak pose prep if you like teaching like in that sort of style. So just to review today's episode, you start by choosing a peak pose that makes sense for your students. So you have to remember who your audience is, and the more you know your students, like the easier it is going to be for you to pick a peak pose. Once you've picked a peak pose that you feel is appropriate for your group, you are going to take a good hard look at it, and you're going to break it down into its key actions and component parts. Then you are going to build your sequence by gradually layering those actions into the body in a way that feels logical and progressive. From there, the peak pose is going to feel like it fits naturally into the arc of the class. And what comes after the peak pose is going to help balance the energy, and like give students a bit of time to integrate the work they've done. I feel like a big part of teaching and teaching in this way is just staying responsive to the room. And you have to go into this remembering that sometimes the peak pose happens and sometimes it doesn't. At the end of the day, peak pose sequencing is one method out of many methods that can help you teach with more clarity and with more intention. I feel like it gives your students really clear direction. And as a teacher, it can help you organize your ideas. So it is a really powerful educational tool when it's used thoughtfully. So if you've been curious about trying out this method or sequencing around a peak pose in your classes, I hope that this episode gives you like just the tiniest little bit of a framework to start experimenting with it and kind of adapting it to your own teaching style and to the needs of your students. So thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Yoga Insider Podcast. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you next time.